All right, everyone, let's get this party started. Sorry, this is coming a bit late. Cox went out at Cox, the cable company, went out at the apartment complex where I live, so I ran up to campus to record this. So anyway, without further ado, let's get started. We're not reading chapter 4, but I am going to discuss certain aspects of it, mainly to help us understand what's happening in chapter 5, and especially the breakdown of states, which we'll talk about on Thursday and probably into next week. Next couple of 2-3 weeks, the contents of the course kind of merge together in some interesting, fortuitous ways. I'm going to look at the exam again. I think there may have been one bad question or one that I need to perhaps re-examine. Maybe not, though. I'll have that figured out by Wednesday. So the moral foundation papers are in. We'll have those graded hopefully by late October, November 1st, I think is what we're going for. So I will be posting the instructions for the final paper. Those will be posted probably tomorrow, if not sooner. We won't be, as I said, we won't be reading chapter 4 and 5, but I will be discussing it. So chapters 4 and 5 really get into something that's been kind of at the heart of a lot of politics in the United States and around the world, and that's this idea of globalization and the process of globalization as people and culture and money and goods and everything flows around the globe. There have been tremendous things about it, and there have been tremendously bad things about it, and it kind of depends on what you're looking at, what your view is, and so on. I would say a lot of the 1990s, a lot of the anti-globalization movement was primarily coming from the left, and it was primarily opposed to gigantic corporations, destroying smaller industries, small family businesses, and homogenizing, American life and their exploitation of workers and the environment, the environment and so on. More recently, in the last going on at that same time, but really picking up even more over the last 10 to 15 years, has been an opposition to immigration and people from other cultures moving in to, the United States or whatever country it might be. So there's been, more calls for stricter immigration laws by some and more open laws by others. Now, I think the best definition of globalization is this one by Roland Robertson, or at least I think he captures globalization best by recognizing, first of all, that it's interdependence and that it's the processes by which the lives of all people around the planet become increasingly intertwined, along with our awareness of such interconnections. And as I said, we have a couple of competing models. And we'll probably see these models really compete in the years ahead between those who want to either literally or figuratively wall off their countries from outside influences, outside people, outside viruses, that sort of thing. Versus those societies that are going to try to be more open, more inclusive, and so on. Right now, the United States, historically has generally, historically for the last 30 or 40 years has generally been a very welcome and open country. Before that, there were a series of immigration laws to restrict immigration from certain parts of Europe or all of Asia or other places that the elites at the time didn't want people coming from. But at the end of the day, there needs to be trade across even walls, and we've seen that throughout world history, and the history of trade obviously begins in Africa. But we're starting to think now to kind of rethink how we have conceptualized history, where the standard story taught in the United States and most of Europe is this idea of, there being the Roman Empire, it collapsing, and then you get feudalism, and then you get the rise of the modern nation state. And isn't this sounding familiar to the class that you're taking right now? Over the last few years, there's been a shift, and the shift is to recognize, perhaps, at least take Europe out of the centrality of the narrative and think about Asia, for example, and the role that the Silk Road has played from China and Japan all the way to Europe then. Another interesting book, From Silk to Silicon, looking at globalization over the last couple thousand years through 10 people's lives. I think it begins with Genghis Khan, the Mongol emperor, and then ends with Steve Jobs, the Apple computer emperor. So the Silk Road was not just one road. It referred to really all these different paths by which various things, not just silk, but especially spices and other goods, came from various parts of Asia and made it to all the way to Europe. It eventually linked Japan all the way to England, although, by the time those goods got there, if they even got there, they were quite expensive. And those expenses is what fueled the quest by Europeans to find a quicker way to India and China and not have to worry about all the, middlemen throughout Central Asia and in Southern Europe and so on. And so they funded people like Christopher Columbus and others. Other things that were going on, remember at this time, the major powers are all maritime powers. So France and Spain and the Dutch and Holland, Great Britain, and so on. Japan in a slightly different way. So the Dutch, though, if you remember, the Dutch, their sort of feudalism was not one unitary king. They had this sort of competition amongst different elite families, and there was this competition among these sort of like merchant families that actually created the first stock market as they were trying to figure out how to value their goods and, conjunction with projected supply, demand, and things like that. Although those ideas weren't quite, as thought out as perhaps they are now. Now, the problem, though, is that each of these little kind of like principalities that these elites ran could veto taxes that could be used then for a national navy or national army. And basically, without a navy, there's not much they could do as the British built up their, tremendous navy and beat the Spanish Armada and, all of these things became this incredible naval power. In the Netherlands, the elites at this time kind of held power through these contracts of correspondence where they basically, planned to help each other out, and it was the way in which the area was governed, and the fortunes that they were receiving from colonization were governed. But as I said, their days of being major colonial powers didn't last, as Britain became a more substantial naval power. And at one point, they would say that the sun never sets on the British Empire because the British Empire, some part of the globe where the sun was shining, was a British colony. today you could say that the sun never sets on the U.S. military because, with 800 plus military bases, known military bases around the world, it's quite likely that there's always sun shining on one of them. So just, the British Empire, kind of felt this drive to civilize the world, and so you see all the different peoples of the world under the British flag. Wider still and wider shall thy bounds be set, the idea there. Now this was all part of what we call mercantilism, where these are state policies that were essentially running companies. They were figuring out how to, tax and so on and so forth. And they would essentially set up these companies and back them. And you may wonder, what's the difference today? We are seeing sort of a shift back toward more mercantilistic policies in the United States and in China, for example. Nonetheless, they're still different than what we had then. This is kind of pre-capitalism. We're sort of moving from the feudal urban towns and the markets that are developing there to these ships and these colonies and this greater ability to extract resources, and it became clear for a lot of these countries that they needed to charter these companies and give them militiamen and so on to help them get all the gold and fur and all the stuff that they needed from the colonies. So these are some of the early logos of the early companies. The East India Company, the British East India Company, that eventually essentially ran England for a while. You can see there the logo there. There's a word that's not able to be pronounced by humans except by the Dutch, and people who know how to speak Dutch, which aren't me, or the French, and I won't try and butcher those two languages right now. But those were some of these early mercantilist companies. I talked about that already, but Britain and Netherlands became commercial and manufacturing centers, but the Dutch state never gained that power to fully control industry and manufacturing and the Navy and so on, because of these different competing elite families, as opposed to Great Britain, where you had a very powerful state. Now, what about France? France was another major power. They had many colonies. But France, as we know, also had a lot of problems. And remember, we talked about venality, those venal offices that were basically bought. These were corrupt offices in the French monarchy. And so mercantilism in France was basically, it didn't really work out because the king couldn't really extract the revenue necessary because these venal officials would, kind of pocket some of their money, or they would try to prevent, tax hikes because they didn't want to, piss off the peasant, or sometimes they wanted to have more control over the ability to raise taxes and enact tariffs and so on. So again, you were seeing sort of a decaying aristocracy already right here in France, while the other major powers are, backing these major companies. It's just not happening in France, as they're trying to maintain their feudal system. Well, the English maintain their feudal system, although throughout this time, their feudal system is becoming less and less powerful as Parliament becomes more and more powerful. And they're becoming a global power, and part of with big part of it being the East India Company. And there's a fantastic book that came out a couple of years ago, The Anarchy, that's about the East India Company and essentially how they, took over India, and essentially ran it for quite some time. Now, to understand what this process, this sort of early colonialism, imperialist process that then we see lead to industrialization, once you get a lot of these resources together, there become a number of different ways to try to approach this and understand what's going on. The most radical at the time was not just coming from Lenin, but he kind of embodied it. Where Marx had recognized imperialism, Lenin really focused on it because by that time imperialism had become a more sort of pervasive force in the world. And he wrote a book called Imperialism, and he saw it as this sort of kind of one of the last phases of capitalism, where the sort of military capitalist domination of the world that, is only bound to fail because it can't support its people anymore, because it has to support the army, and so on and so forth. Lenin says, if it were necessary to give the briefest possible definition of imperialism, we should have to say that imperialism is the monopoly stage of capitalism. So that was Lenin's idea, and he helped start a revolution that ended pretty terribly for the people of Russia. I'll talk about that in a future lecture. Other people who have tried to understand this model of imperialism have looked at it in terms of this idea of the world system. Emanuel Wallerstein, a sociologist, came up with this idea. He was studying countries in Africa and looking at their economic development, and he was wondering why they were not developing in the same way that many other countries were at that time. And as we'll talk about, there was a certain predominant theory. And so he started re-examining how the world was working. At that time, at least the capitalist world, he wasn't really paying too much attention to the Soviet world and the communist world, which is kind of a major blind spot in a world system theory, but nonetheless, he was looking at the capitalist world and sort of the flows of goods and people and trade and money and everything. And he identified a number of countries that he called core countries. And these would be like the United States, many European countries, Western European countries, Japan, for example, and then periphery countries where you have cheap labor and raw materials that basically provide the goods to the core countries. Then the semi-periphery are kind of in the middle. They have some wealthy people that are able to buy high consumption goods, but they also rely on cheap labor and raw materials, and sometimes that also goes to the core. So what would some example, what might some examples be? Well, as I said, the periphery would be back in the 1970s, 80s, actually really the 1980s and 1990s, you might think of China as being semi-periphery. At one time periphery, moving quickly to, semi-periphery, and now quickly to core. But anyway, periphery countries would be countries, especially during the 80s and 90s when this theory was especially big, Taiwan and Malaysia, Vietnam, a lot of countries, low-wage countries, essentially, that are making goods for the core countries. The problem with this model is, that it doesn't always doesn't always account for some of the changes that have happened. So, where China lies here is not quite clear. Where the Soviet countries lie, or where they were and how they joined the world system, hasn't been articulated, at least not in a way that I find particularly impressive or convincing. So anyway, however, the one good thing that it did though was it got us to think about, okay, the systemic aspects of how the world economy works and how different countries play different roles, and how we're all interconnected in various ways. And it also paid attention to changes in the world system. In fact, now a lot of the research is looking at those changes, at least of the people who are still doing that research. Latin America most of it became independent in the 19th century. Simon de Bolivar was a major figure there. What we saw happen, one of the reasons this happened was that the Habsburgs were just not doing the greatest job of ruling back in Europe. They favored aristocratic elites, and they didn't really care for merchants, and they primarily funded these conquistadors who went and, enslaved people and massacred people and so on and so forth. And over time, these conquistadors became powerful landowners, almost feudal lords of themselves. And they became more and more independent. And as a result, the Habsburgs and thus the Spanish crown, they rapidly saw their revenue fall from from the New World. It went from 30% in the 1500s to 1% by the 1650s. So in 150 years, the wealth is basically all wiped out, and you have these new landowners in South America. And actually, these slides are backwards. I knew something was a little weird, but and then Bolivar helped lead independence in a number of places and inspired a lot of other movements. Now, this isn't a perfect, an exact picture of social classes in the Spanish colonies, but it's, kind of an approximation. And you get the Spanish aristocrats, people who have come from Spain, already have a lot of money, their descendants. Then you get sort of the mix of white and Indian people, mestizos, mulattoes. You have a lot of African people who are brought over as slaves. A lot of people aren't aware of this, but 42% of the slaves that were brought over from Western Africa were not taken to North America, but were actually taken to Brazil. And another 38% were taken to the Caribbean, and actually only 5% of the total were taken to North America. Although there was also a migration later from the Caribbean to the Americas. But again, a lot of people aren't aware that the majority, or the the most, were actually going to Brazil. And then at the bottom you had Native Americans and African slaves, and where they were kind of depended actually on where they were physically, geographically. Well, why didn't you get mechanization? Why didn't you get a big industrial revolution take off in Latin America, as was sort of in the works in Europe at this time? I mean, you had these miners, you had plenty of raw materials by which you could have developed an industry, a modern industry. Well, basically, they weren't really mining to, come up with things for themselves, but really to mine gold and silver and some of these old world, in some ways, feudalistic pursuits. But you also had the other elites who were landowners, and they had agriculture. And this sort of this worked out well for both of the landowners and slave owners essentially, and so they didn't want mechanization. They didn't want some new machine to come in and help do crops quicker, because it may have undermined their positions, because they were like I said, they were kind of like feudal lords at this time, and technology is a big reason feudalism kind of fell apart over time. Over time, you saw that the estate owners won out. Costa Rica is kind of an interesting place. They were able to make a balance between the estate owners, excuse me, and the industrial elites. But after the Second World War, a lot of these countries and a lot of other poor countries in the world become subject to the International Monetary Fund and the World Bank. After the Second World War, most of Europe was in ruins, and most of the places that had been colonies of Europe were now new countries. John Maynard Keynes helped develop this, this world. Also had lots of ideas about how the government should get involved if there's economic crashes. There's a big debate about whether or not that's accurate or not. You can figure that one out for yourselves. So two institutions that become important are the World Bank. It provides loans to poor countries, initially for Europe, then expands it after the Second World War. Then the IMF, the International Monetary Fund, again, provides loans and assistance for, take a guess, I guess. No, for whatever reason, didn't write the rest of that sentence. It provides loans for poor countries that are building infrastructure projects like dams or bridges or that sort of thing. So this is all in the aftermath of the Second World War. And the Second World War, leads to a lot of things. It leads to, one, this realization that the ideas of the late 1800s and early 1900s about, continual progress were a bit short-sighted. And, in the wake of the Holocaust and, Japan's subjugation of a lot of East Asia, and then the bombing of Japan and so on, made people realize that the world is actually a lot more unstable and, more prone to conflict than previously believed. So this led to the creation of the United Nations in San Francisco, the idea being that, okay, before everybody gets together and goes to war with each other, we'll get together and, try and work out some sort of compromise. And it has actually worked more often than not. Oftentimes when we hear about the UN, there's, something they failed to do or whatever, but they put out a lot of useful information, a lot of studies, and as I said, they provide kind of a place for countries to air their grievances and that kind of thing. Of course, they kind of had to navigate where to be within the Cold War. As the Soviet Union and the United States primarily, kind of went at this Cold War with each other, with China occupying a sort of an interesting middle ground. China was never, really on the side of the Soviet Union, and actually was very opposed to the ways in which the Soviet Union practiced communism, and the Soviet Union was very opposed to the way China practiced communism. Kind of an interesting history there. One of the things that hasn't been studied as much is the role that China played over the last 50 or 60 years internationally. There's been a lot more research, at least in English. There's been a lot more research on, the Soviet Union and what they were up to. Not as much on China, or not even just China, but the spread of Mao Zedong's ideas, for example. Well, a lot of the Cold War comes to an end with the fall of the Berlin Wall, and then you get huge protests in the Czech Republic. You get protests finally in the Soviet Union, and it breaks apart, becomes Russia, and there's an attempt in China at Tiananmen Square, and it's put down by the military there. And, the next day there's this famous footage of this guy walking out and blocking these tanks, and he moves over to the side and he's grabbed and pulled away, and don't know who those people are, if they're plainclothes policemen or or what. It's unclear. Interestingly, I think there's a New York Times journalist who video recorded this, heard a knock at his door, and he took out the film and put it in the back chamber of his toilet, and let him in. And it was the secret police, the Chinese police, and they wanted all his film. They had seen the reflection of the camera up in the hotel window, and so he gave them all his footage except that footage in the chamber, and was able to smuggle it out. And that's why today we have this image. I think it's one of the more powerful images, because this guy is, if you watch the video, it's quite dramatic, because he just stands there. They tell him to leave, they try to go around him, and he just walks over the side and plants himself there again. To this day, don't know who he is, don't know what happened to him. Probably dead or languishing in a prison is what I would imagine, but who knows? Perhaps he's safe and living a wonderful old age, eating McDonald's in communist China or something. So anyway, I kind of just went through all of that. So the other big thing that's going on now, 1970s, you get into the rise of what's called neoliberalism. What's that? Does that mean like very left-wing? No, here again, we're talking about liberalism in that broader philosophical sense of like classical liberalism, and the idea of, open markets, free markets, and democracy, anti-Marxism. Really, some of these ideas laid down by Milton Friedman, the economist, enacted first by Margaret Thatcher in England, and much more dramatically because the rail workers industry and like the trash collectors were all nationalized, and she broke them up and privatized them, and there were big strikes and many revolts, and it was a pretty chaotic period. Another area, you can't talk about neoliberalism without talking about Augusto Pinochet in Chile. So in 1972, Salvador Allende, a left-wing socialist, was elected president in Chile's first democratic elections. But he was a socialist, so, the Western Hemisphere couldn't have that. And so Pinochet, who was part of the military, and others along with it, is believed the CIA, among others, enacted a coup. Allende killed himself before, getting captured and, undoubtedly tortured and whatnot. Pinochet killed many, many people, but put sort of a lock on the communist and socialist groups in the country, and then allowed a group of economists, free market economists from Chicago, to come down. At the University of Chicago, there was this group called the Chicago Boys, and they were not boys, but they were of that gender, and they were very much enamored with the ideas of radical free markets and so on, and they came down and essentially made Chile this sort of kind of neoliberal playland for a while, and it worked out economically fairly well for people in Chile, although he still committed war crimes, and there's a lot of debate about just how good he really was for that country. Taking us through the decades. Soviet Union's gone. Russia is this new country that's, trying out capitalism. The new millennium is coming. The attitude at this time was very was very non-political. I mean, I remember growing up this time, and politics were not something not anyone, but most people really didn't pay much attention to. For the most part, people were dazzled by how cheap everything was and how available things were getting, and this new thing called the internet, and so on. Bill Clinton was a very skillful politician. He basically would take kind of Republican ideas and take them as his own. Like, oh, that's a pretty good idea. We'll embrace some of that. And he left office with a pretty high approval rating. I think it was like 73% or something, which is quite good. I don't think it's hard for me to imagine someone who could get such a high approval rating now. A very different society that we live in. You get the dot-com bubble here. It's not just happens to coincide with Bush's presidency. I don't think he did anything to cause it or anything. It just happens at that time. But it, begins to build back up, and then boom, the housing market explodes. This guy, Alan Greenspan, he was seen as this like oracle on Wall Street, this visionary, and he basically believed that, if you leave business people and markets alone and unregulated, unsupervised, that things will just kind of work out in a perfect equilibrium. That didn't happen. Everything fell apart. In 2008, it turned out to be a complete mess. People were gaming systems left and right, and to this day, nobody has gone to prison for it. I mean, it's really shocking what people were able to get away with back about 10, 12 years ago or so. Anyway, Greenspan, he gave this testimony in front of Congress, and it was very striking because he said that the model that I thought, excuse me, something along the lines of the world did not work according to the model that I thought it did. And, that was a huge admission that, that he was wrong, that this idea that, markets are self-regulating, is a fantasy. And it, every few decades it gets pushed, and we generally see the same results. At the same time, we also do see tremendous innovation and employment and expansion and so on. And I guess I kind of skipped Obama there, but anyway, Obama would be there kind of carrying on in some ways the policies of Clinton and Bush and kind of this general international approach. However, Trump comes in with a much more nationalistic approach, and in some ways is part of this rise of stronger leaders. When I say strongmen leaders, people who act strong, at least, who we see in many positions of power around the world today. And we'll talk about why that is this weekend, next week in particular. Nonetheless, we now have Joe Biden as president, who wants to kind of, reestablish America's place. But, Americans are, the rest of the world is kind of watching, saying, well, we just watched the Capitol get invaded, and, you've got like 30% of the population that doesn't, believe the election was legitimate. And so people are very wary of, the United States. The United States could fall back into whatever it was in. But more broadly, this raises some questions about the West. What was the West? It's a fantastic journal issue on this idea of the West. And it's often associated with the Enlightenment and causal reasoning. Also universalism. So this is where it's kind of difficult, because one of the things that's very characteristic of the West is that it pushes universal rights. Well, that in some ways, that is a universal doctrine. It's not really, it's supposed to apply to everyone, essentially. And we all know that, the West has certainly denied universal rights and individual rights in practice. Still, we see that many of the practices and lifestyles and habits and so on of the West have been adopted. Lots of people watch television around the world. T-shirts and pants, modern pants and jeans became, a style that's been adopted by most people in the world, and so on and so forth. So the West still has a very unique ability to shape what's going on in the world. Yet, as we'll talk about specifically in a future lecture, China is offering a different model. We see that they have much more advanced much more technologically advanced infrastructure. We see here, though, a model that provides protection, prosperity for its citizens, but takes away individual human rights, certain environmental protections, and so on. So China's moving from, a sort of semi-periphery country, and to think about it in world systems, that's, mainly just producing stuff for Americans, to a more self-sufficient economy. Now, a lot of Americans are not that familiar with China's history, not as much as the other way around, and I'm saying that proportionally, not just in terms of sheer numbers. But the three major rulers of the last of the People's Republic of China, Mao Zedong, who started China, Chinese communism, tried what was called the Great Leap Forward to try to, rapidly, industrialize and develop agricultural, wonders and so on. Didn't work out. It fell apart. Tens of millions of people died. And then it was also associated with the Cultural Revolution, which was this attempt to, take out the remaining bourgeois and of society, these small business owners, professors, and intellectuals that may not be pro-communist and so on. And a lot of them were killed or put in labor camps and so on. And his reign was pretty bloody, ended with a lot of turmoil. In China, essentially, was in kind of a state of turmoil till Deng Xiaoping took power. He was one of these original revolutionaries, but he also was one to recognize that China had to open up and engage more with the rest of the world's economy. He saw the Soviet Union as crumbling, and he saw that something similar might happen in China unless China, joined the world economy. And so it's under Deng Xiaoping that we start to see, the emergence of, Nike, the emergence of factories in China that were Western brands. And really, after his reign in the 1980s and through the 1990s and 2000, you have a series of leaders who basically represent continuity up until 2012, when Xi Jinping comes to power. And he came to power by pushing out a lot of his rivals, as we'll talk about. We'll read an analysis of some of his speeches. But he's the closest thing that China has to Mao that we've seen. As I said, we'll talk more about him later, but he in many ways tries to combine certain aspects of Deng Xiaoping, and more open economy with the rest of the world, but also Mao. So he's also cracking down on a lot of dissent and making some making some gestures toward Taiwan and things like this. So this kind of pulls him more in the direction of Mao more than Deng Xiaoping. Well, why am I all of a sudden talking about Africa? Dambisa Moyo, great analyst, she wrote this book a number of years ago called Dead Aid, basically saying a lot of international aid for Africa was not working because it was just propping up, corrupt dictatorships. She was saying, actually, what you want to do is try to open markets so that these countries can trade more freely. Anyway, she also wrote a book more recently looking at China and, its race for resources, as it says in the book, called Winner Take All. And the idea here being that, the world economy relies upon these unique minerals, these rare earth metals, many of which are in China, most of which are in China, I believe, and many of which are in parts of Africa or other parts of the world where we've seen China move in quite aggressively. Look at China, for example, here. China as a trading partner of African states back in 1996, just Gambia. Take that to 2015-16, and you've got most of Africa. The number one place that they're doing business with is China, and that doesn't mean that these other countries aren't doing business with China. They just aren't, a number one import source. But of course, we know that some of that is under threat. Under threat from coronavirus. China's taken an interesting approach. China locks down very severely each time that there's an outbreak, which in the early days was a very good thing. The problem now, though, interestingly enough, in that sort of counterintuitive way, is that you have less immunity in the population. So, at some point China is going to have to open up, and inevitably not everybody is going to be vaccinated at that point. And you will see more infections, and, it'll be interesting to see how China addresses that. So anyway, there's always this potential for disease, and before the coronavirus was messing up the economy, we were starting to see tariffs, and we were starting to see, this emerging tariff war between the United States and China, as well as the United States and many other countries. And so a tariff is basically a tax on goods that are coming from overseas or other countries being sold in our home country market, in the U.S. or wherever your home country is. And so it may cost a bit more for, say, this British cloth to be sold in the U.S., but, maybe it's a higher quality, or it's got pictures of, teacups on it or something. And, it just, people are willing to pay that extra money for the brand. So that's one thing where we see, tensions being played out is some of these tariffs. So that's something you want to pay attention to. We're also, as I said, China is moving from being this export center to being if not completely self-sufficient, much more self-sufficient society than it once was. I mean, it amazes me, but that there are a lot of Americans who have never heard of Alibaba. Alibaba is like Amazon plus, Twitter plus a number of other major, social media companies. It provides an incredible amount of information for the Chinese consumer. Also, just kind of in the area in South Korea, you also see, as the state developed, it was at first a military dictatorship, The peasantry essentially became the workforce, and over time you started to see the emergence of these major Korean firms, South Korean firms, the chaebols. And these are these companies where a lot of it stays within the family. And right now I think there's some, some challenges, that they're facing, trying to where people by the third or fourth generation may not want to stay in the business, or maybe the business isn't what it once was, or whatever it might be. So anyway, something to think about and watch. When we looked at the pre-capitalist world, people were mainly beholden to their clan or their nation state. Today we live in a much more multicultural, flowing world, but at the same time we still have those strong national identities. And this, excuse me, I don't remember if I explained this, but these are this represents the socialist, or at least anti kind of monarchy revolts of the 1800s, the various protests of the 1960s, the anti-communist protests of the 1980s, the various protests of today. Notice the coffee and the smartphone. This actually you don't need to pay attention to this. This will show up in another lecture. So the next chapter in the book talks about the breakdown of state breakdowns, and I'll be talking about that and talking about how a lot of the theories failed. So the world systems theory was problematic because it didn't operate so simply. There are countries like China or other countries that were core and periphery, and it was very hard to figure out where some of these places where they stood. Rostow, I think it was like William Rostow, I believe, had these 5 stages of growth roughly around the same time, starting with traditional society where there's just subsistence and bartering. Then you get specializations and surpluses and infrastructure. Then you start to get industry and political change, and then you get innovation and 401ks and all that. And then you get the service sector, and everybody's getting McDonald's and everything like that, and so on. And this was basically, how they thought all countries would develop. And what happens in reality is that it very rarely goes specifically up these 5 stages. Sometimes it will leapfrog from, a traditional society up to an industrial society, or up to a more diversified, innovative society. A lot of East Asian countries, did not follow, these steps neatly. But this was sort of the dominant thinking amongst a lot of people in power in the West during the second half of the 20th century. And based on these assumptions, I think a lot of mistakes were made, and kind of a mistaken view of the world was taught to a lot of people. They didn't have the benefit of reading these books that we do now. So obviously your book talks about this. This is one I thought about us reading in class, but it's kind of too focused on war and society. But that's one thing that a lot of these theories don't really take into account, is the role that conflict plays, the role that war plays, and the role that social movements in general play, and what happens when states break down. Many states have broken down throughout history and in recent times, and we'll talk next time about some of the more recent instances of this. We'll talk about this on Wednesday. because we are heading, I'm afraid, into a time when you may want to pick up some of these more, pessimistic books, if for nothing else to, just understand what's happened in the past. The collapse. This is the classic, The Collapse of Complex Societies by Joseph Tainter. He looks at Mayan civilization, the New Mexican civilization before it was, New Mexico and America. Looks at a number of other societies as well, and I'll kind of talk about that last time. Dmitry Orlov, kind of an interesting new thinker. I'll talk about him too. John Michael Greer, interesting guy. He's a druid, an arch druid. So he writes about like occult stuff and a lot of interesting stuff. But he has this book called Dark Age America. It came out a few years ago, 2014. Even before the pandemic and everything that's happened over the last few years. If you read it now, he seems pretty prescient. I mean, he seems to have a pretty good view of what the future is probably going to hold for us. I would also emphasize this book. I don't know if you can see it or if it's backwards, but The Narrow Corridor, States, Societies, and the Fate of Liberty. The authors Asimoglu and Robinson. They also wrote a book called Why Nations Fail, which we will probably talk about on Wednesday. All right, everyone, on that note, just be ready to talk about social collapse next time we see each other.